Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about the Dungeons and Dragons 5e Dungeon Master Bullet Point Problem Storyteller. All right. I have an apology for you if you do not know what the Dungeon Master Bullet Point Problem is. You have a little bit of homework. You have to watch the video in the doobly-doo down below. And unfortunately, without watching that, you're not going to have context for what I talk about today. Many apologies. I hate giving people homework for videos, but it's just so that I can avoid repeating myself in every video, which is not fun for anyone. All right, so let's talk about the Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition Dungeon Master Bullet Point Problem Storyteller instance. All right, so one of the disciplines you are calling someone to, that a dungeon master is called to master, is storytelling. Okay, now this is distinct from writer, right? You also need to master being a writer in order to be a good dungeon master. In order to be, and actually, you know what? You don't have to say good dungeon master, right? Dungeon master means you have mastered doing it, right? Like, the master is a really important part of the word, right? And so, like, you're not a dungeon gooder, you're not a dungeon okayer, you're a dungeon master, and you're called to master storytelling. Now, what is storytelling, and how is it distinct from being a writer, right? Well, storytelling is telling a story in the space you have, and also layering stories within a story, especially for dungeon mastery, okay? So what do I mean by this? So first of all, when you are a dungeon master, you are going to have an adventure, okay? Now, the reality is, increasingly, I like to make sure that each session is succinct and is kind of a bottle episode. It's contained in one, right? There's a quest. The player characters go out and they complete the quest. They receive their reward, okay? And of course, as a dungeon master, you don't always get that capped into one session. It might arc over 2 sessions, but generally you want to tell a story within each session, okay? And pacing is incredibly important. Pacing is important for stories, right? Also, stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. They also, almost all stories have humor. It could be very dry. It could be subtle humor. Some of it's sometimes it's boisterous laughter, right? And stories have stake, right? But this idea that we tell stories, it's not small. It's a huge part of telling, of being a dungeon master, right? And of being a dungeon master specifically. One of the ways we know this is there were shamans. There were shamans for thousands of years. They're still around today. I don't think they really play the role that they used to. It's different to be a shaman today than I think it was at any point in our history. It's different. But shamans told stories for a long time. Now, with Dungeons and Dragons, storytelling is dramatically different than what shamans did. But for a long time, shamans would tell stories, okay? And we're still doing that now, but frankly, we have to do it better. And we have to be better at it than shamans ever were, right? So basically, let's talk about the storytelling. So let's do a traditional quest, right? So the player characters are let's say a dragon was recently slain, right? And the player characters are at a tavern, and someone talks about deathfall, right? And this is one of the stories. This is one of the stories that happened in my game recently, right? So a dragon was slain, and the adventurers are in a tavern, and another adventurer talks to them about deathfall, and they're like, "What's deathfall?" And he's like, "Well, when a dragon, dragons are magical creatures. When they fall, right? When they die in a specific place, that central location, right, is a source of magic for weeks or months or even years after, right? And anybody who slew that dragon, or anyone who didn't, can go to that deathfall place and bind that land to themselves. That means that all of the parts of the dragon, all of the the material that were in the dragon's lair, which was a different location than where the dragon fell, right, can all be identified by anybody who's bounded the land. And also the echoes of power that existed within the dragon can then be accessed at different levels by whoever binds themselves to the point of the deathfall, right? So the player characters are questing, right? And now they're like, oh, we got to get to the deathfall. We got to bind that land. We got to decide who amongst us is going to be bound to the land. This specific location where the dragon fell. And we also need to do this immediately because that shady group of that group over there of shady rogues, shady sorcerer, and another shady rogue looks like they're leaving immediately after overhearing this conversation. So we got to race them and get there before they do and bind the land, right? So that's a story, right? And then they're going to travel there. They're going to have to fight that other group in order to, bind the land to themselves rather than allow these evil rogues and sorcerers to do it, right? And then also, once they've done, they can go back to the same tavern and they can tell the adventurer, and say, hey, we did it, and then he can congratulate them and they can have their celebratory pint of mead, right? Story, right? Well, not quite, right? This is where storytelling comes in as a dungeon master, okay? So you could write what I just wrote, okay? A good writer could write that, right? What I'm talking about is storytelling, okay? So the players leave the tavern at the town, okay? And they begin and they come out and first of all, they one of them has been having problems with their armor recently, got bent up really bad when they were in a goblin warren, right? And one of them has a great a great set of plate armor, but that plate armor was badly dented in one of the in several places in a goblin warren fight, right? Some rocks fell, and since then, the dungeon master has said, once per combat, I'm going to give you a disadvantage on one of your rolls because your plate armor is, for the fighter, is actually damaged, right? So basically, you have this situation where you have this situation where one of the players has damage armor. Well, they come across a tinkerer, okay? And the tinkerer is there. You're going to give them an opportunity. The tinkerer's like, hey, we're going to spend half a day here, but I'm going to take off your entire, plate armor. You guys are going to go over there and sit in that nice glade, and I'm going to spend the entire morning hammering and getting your armor fixed, right? Well, while he's doing this, he's working really hard, and the player characters start talking to the tinkerer, okay? Now, this is where being a master storyteller is critical, okay? What you find out when you start talking to the tinkerer is that he's close to retirement, but he doesn't know what to do. And the reality is, he's talking and he starts talking about this woman 2 villages back, right? The lady who makes the herb butter in a small town, right? Well, for the last 3 days, while the player characters were in that town, they had that herb butter, and they said, this is some of the best herb butter I've ever had. Who makes this? And they're like, oh, that's Sally Fell, and she lives up on the hill, and she was widowed. She had a woodcutter husband, and he's been dead for 10 years, but she makes the butter, and everybody in the town loves her, right? And everybody knows her because she has a shock of white hair. She has just a shock of gray hair in the middle of but all the rest of her hair is black, right? Well, when the tinkerer describes this woman, he describes her, and the player characters already know her, right? And any player characters that's paying attention they also realize as the tinkerer is fixing the armor, he's very sore, right? And you can just see he's old, right? He doesn't belong on the road anymore, and he's good at what he does, but it's taking a physical toll from him, right? This is storytelling, a story within a story. And when this tinkerer comes across them, this is in the middle of the game, right? And you've got to be able to attach these type of compelling, dramatic stories in the moment, right? And you have to be able to build them without writing them first, right? right? And you need to be responsive to what the dice are saying, to what each player is saying, to the inspiration that happens in your own heart and mind, right? You need to be responsive, and you need to do these stories, right? And this is exactly what shamans did. They did not put pen to paper. They mastered the incredibly unique and important discipline of verbal tales, right? Storytelling. And this is just one discipline that dungeon masters are called to master. And again, shamans were trained by other shamans and spent their entire lives mastering this ability to tell compelling, dramatic, humorous, wonderful, heartwarming tales in the moment, right? Storytelling, distinct from writing. We're called to it. What is the what goes wrong if you cannot master storytelling? Well, here, if you are not able to do this, you have a dry game. You have a desiccated game, right? And what is really happening is it's almost like if you were just running a pre-gen adventure. You're wasting your players' time, okay? And again, in the old days, who cared, right? If you lived in 1980, what are we going to do? You're going to turn on one of your 6 channels that were on television. You can read some of the books that have been written in the last 60 years, right? Maybe you went out to the movies. The entire video game industry really didn't exist. It was just spinning up, and it was like Pong, right? Or maybe a little better, but not much. There wasn't much there, right? Now we have 600 channels, not 6 on television, right? And the reality is, and the other issue is, we are spinning into a new, because we as humans are becoming far more peaceful and are leaving violence behind. Each one of us can craft these incredibly robust lives, right? And where we accomplish goals, and every minute counts, right? We only got 70, 90, 110 years on this planet. That's it. Then, now I'll have eternity after that, because I'm blessed to be saved by the blood of Jesus Christ. But not everybody's got that, right? Like, some people just got 110 years, and then it's the other place or nowhere, depending on who's right? Like, I'm very confident in my faith, but I think a lot of people are like, oh, I'll just go into nothingness, right? So I'm not on a clock, but you are. You might be, right? Like, so now, and also, I'm not positive there's going to be Dungeons and Dragons in heaven. So even I'm on the clock for Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like, so basically, it's you can't waste people's time. So if you get this wrong, you are wasting, and you can waste a lot of time, right? It's 4 players with a 2 to 4 hour game. Let's say you're doing it right and you're running 2-hour games and not a 4-hour game. That's 8 hours of people's time you're wasting each session, right? If you run for even 3 months, right? That's 32 hours. That's close to it's 96 hours, almost 100 hours of these people's lives they will never get back, because they wasted them on your desiccated game because you didn't take the time to master storytelling. Right? So that's the part that happens if you get this wrong, and you want to get it right, right? So, the reality is, we call people to the life path of Dungeon Master carefully, hesitantly. Do they have the intellectual structure, right, that they're going to need in order to master these disciplines, right? Do they have a strong heart? If they find that they love dungeon mastering but fail at it, that can be devastating, right? And so basically, we really do not call people to dungeon mastering lightly. All that's my opinion. I'm really curious, you as a dungeon master, how do you manage the difference between writing and storytelling? It's critically different. What do you do to make sure that you are able to unlock your inspiration at a moment's notice and tell compelling stories within the stories, right? Not just what you wrote, but then adding compelling stories within the story. How do you get there, right? I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you do. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.